So we've been discussing times when markets are inefficient without government intervention. And specifically, we've been looking at externalities. So we defined externalities in the previous video, and in this video, we want to spend some time thinking about how we can correct the inefficiencies caused by externalities. So let's look at it on our typical supply and demand graph. So remember that a negative externality occurs when there is a cost to a third party associated with a particular market activity. And so when there is that cost, it means that your internal cost of production is lower than the actual cost, the social cost of production of whatever good or service. And so if we have this supply and demand diagram that is shown here, if for the firm, so the firms in this market are considering only their internal costs and their internal benefits, so the firms are considering their internal costs and the consumers are considering their internal benefits of this market activity. So we have an internal supply curve that is calculated. So remember, supply is the firm's lowest willingness to accept or lowest willingness to sell their product. So when the firms calculate their lowest willingness to accept according to the internal supply curve, they're calculating it using only their internal costs. And that's how they're deciding what price is the lowest they're willing to accept for their product. If this is a market where there's a negative externality, that means that there is some spillover cost to others. And so if we asked society, not just the firm, to think about what supply curve we should have in this case, if we calculated our lowest willingness to accept or lowest willingness to sell our product based on social costs instead of just on internal costs, we would have a supply curve that's somewhere to the left of our internal supply curve, because we'd be including even more costs of production when we include the cost to third parties because of our externality. And so that means that if we have a social supply curve, if we consider the social costs of our market activity, then we actually would have a socially optimal equilibrium that's somewhere to the left and upward of the market equilibrium that occurs when folks just act and behave in their own self-interest, right? So this says that when people just behave in their own self-interest, which is what we've talked about previously with how markets work, usually that will lead a market to an efficient outcome. It always pushes a market by that invisible hand that Adam Smith talked about, pushes a market toward the market equilibrium point, which in many markets, in a market without an externality, is the most efficient outcome. But in this market, in the market that's represented here on this slide, there's a negative externality, which means when we all behave in our own self-interest, we're doing too much of the activity. Society wishes that we would be at this equilibrium instead, that we would consider the social costs, the external costs of what we're doing rather than just our internal costs. And so if we don't consider social costs and we only consider costs to ourselves, internal costs and internal benefits of the market equilibrium, of the market activity, then we'll be at this equilibrium, which is not socially optimal, which is not efficient. We actually are creating deadweight loss due to our pollution or the cost associated with our market activity to others. So we're actually pushing, by not considering the negative social costs of our market activity, we're actually pushing the market to the right of the optimal, the efficient equilibrium. And when we do that, we create, we've said in previous videos, we're creating sadness instead of creating happiness, which is what we do when we create surplus, right? So we're actually decreasing market surplus by pushing the market beyond the socially optimal number of transactions, the socially optimal equilibrium in the market. Reducing pollution then would eliminate this deadweight loss. If we could get our supply curve to move from the internal supply curve to the social supply curve, we could reduce or eliminate this area of deadweight loss. How do we do that? How do we correct this externality problem? The answer is we have to figure out some way of getting the people who are involved in the market activity to internalize the externality. We want the individual or individuals involved in the activity to take into account the social costs or benefits of their actions. Not just consider your own internal costs, but consider the social costs. Consider the total cost to you and to society, to you and to your neighbors of your doing business, so that he or she, the individuals involved in the activity, are aware of how his or her actions will impact the social welfare of the community, either positively or negatively. So in the case of a negative externality, where, for example, you're a factory and you're polluting the water around you, right? You're causing a cost to your neighbors. You're causing a cost to society that's greater, that's in addition to your own cost of doing business. How do we get you to internalize that externality? Well, there are some options that the government may have to make this happen. You want to make the firm recognize the external cost. You can do that by taxing the product, by saying, okay, for each widget that you produce, each one of your product that you produce, you have to pay the government some amount of money. And in that way, you're making their cost of production a little bit higher than their own internal costs. You're making their cost of production include some extra costs that could be the cost to society, or that will move that supply curve a little bit closer to, or maybe all the way to, if you tax it with the appropriate amount, to move it all the way to that social supply curve rather than the internal supply curve. So you can tax the product. You also could just regulate production. You could say you're not allowed to produce in a way that causes pollution. We're going to come in, the EPA is going to come in and monitor the air quality or the water quality around your firm, and if the pollution is above a certain level, then you'll have to pay a fine or something like that. So we force the firms to recognize the external cost of their market activity. A third thing that the government could do is just to encourage R&D, research and development, of substitutes to the product. So encourage some competition that would sort of use a market force to get these firms either to clean up their act, to think about negative externalities, or maybe to go out of business if they can't, because they're going to now have some competition encouraged. The goal with all of this is to move the firm's costs toward the point where they will equal social costs of doing business, shifting the supply curve to the left and correcting for some of that negative externality, correcting the inefficiency in the market due to that negative externality. So that's negative externalities. What does this picture look like in the case of a positive externality? So an example of something that has positive externalities is vaccine usage, right? So if I only consider my internal benefits of having my child vaccinated, or my family's internal benefits of having my child vaccinated, and don't think about what the benefits might be to others, those in his preschool class, for example, then my internal demand will probably be lower than it would be if I considered the total benefit to society and not just to myself. So if this is the market for vaccines, for example, and here's our market equilibrium when everyone's behaving in their own self-interest, right? So remember that demand is the consumer's highest willingness to pay for a good or a service. if I only consider the benefit to me and my family of a vaccine, then my willingness to pay for that vaccine is lower than it would be if I thought about all the benefits to society. The fact that if my child doesn't get sick, then his classmates are less likely to get sick, and that there's a big snowball effect of the benefits of vaccinations. And so, if I were to think about social benefits, my demand curve, my willingness to pay for vaccines would be somewhere to the right of my internal demand curve. So the social demand curve is to the right of the internal demand curve in the case of a positive externality. And so the socially optimum equilibrium is somewhere to the right of the internal market equilibrium. And if we don't do something to push the internal demand curve toward the social demand curve, we're missing out on some of the surplus that we could have as a society if we pushed those market transactions out further to the right. There's some deadweight loss. There's some inefficiency in this market if there's no intervention to push the demand curve, the internal demand curve, out toward the social demand curve. So how do we do that? How do we correct for a positive externality? Remember, the goal is we want to help individuals realize the external benefits. We want to finance or subsidize production and consumption of the good. We say, if you'll get a vaccine, we'll pay for part of it as the government because we recognize that it's a benefit to society for you to do this. Or we could regulate. We could have laws requiring consumption of particular goods or services. So in the case of vaccines, often you're required to have certain vaccinations before you can attend a public school. That would be this type of regulation. Or we could use more of sort of a market intervention and encourage research and development of similar goods. So we can encourage more folks to get into this market and produce more of the similar goods. All the while, the goal here is that the consumer realizes the full social benefits of whatever market activity they're involved in, and their demand curve shifts to the right.